You all for joining us for today's webinar, Building the Roadmap Together, where we're going to focus on the process and performance management highlights and trends from our recent conference. So just as introduction, I'm Holly Lyke-Ho-Gland, the Principal Research Lead here at APQC for Process and Performance Management. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Jeff Varney.
Hello, everyone. Jeff Varney. I'm Director of Advisory Services here at APQC, and I also have been helping to kind of guide our process and performance management for over 15 years now.
Excellent. Well, we are excited to talk to you all today. So the main thing of what we're going to cover today is in May, APQC had its very first ever combined process and knowledge management conference. Now, the themes of the conference was building the roadmap together, which really explored how process and knowledge teams were able to support new functions, new business models, strategies, as well as new needs in the organization, and also how they retain and create seats at the strategic table for their organization. Now, throughout the conference, people were exchanging experiences, sharing ideas, and collaborating around a range of topics, but there were kind of four key themes that we saw throughout the conference. And the first one is this idea of partnerships. Now, this is looking at strategic partnerships within the organization or with partners outside of the organization to help combine competencies to really make sure that we're better supporting organizational goals and projects. And the second is probably the most tactical theme, and that's methods and technologies. And that was really looking at the core technologies and methodologies that process and performance teams were highlighting throughout their presentations at the conference. And the third one is this idea of solving business problems. And that theme is really applying our capabilities and putting business process management into action and tackling core organizational or business challenges, things such as productivity or customer experience and things along those lines. And then the fourth kind of big theme we're going to cover today is this idea of focusing on people. And that's how we use our well-honed people skills to kind of tackle the hardest part of a lot of our jobs, which is engaging and getting support in the business and employees to execute the work that we're doing. So now I kind of want to start off with our first theme.
Outstanding. Thanks, Holly. I'll jump in and take this one. It's interesting, you know, this concept of building partnerships at APQC and other with our members and other collaborators over the years. We've talked about the alignment between process and knowledge, and that it's always there. But we had really never fully brought the audiences together. There was always some crossover and a little bit of collaboration along the way. And so to really build on this concept of building the roadmap together, this concept of partnerships, we wanted to focus on the conference, and for instance, our keynotes all appealed to both audiences. They weren't a knowledge session or a process session. It was more about shared skills and insights that can drive both disciplines forward, both individually and together. The breakout sessions for the conference were similarly broken up into 6 different types of breakouts, but they weren't knowledge breakouts here and process breakouts there. They were interspersed and really focused more on models and frameworks or people and culture, you know, how to use technology in context that appeal and actually contribute to both audiences again. So this whole concept of partnership was baked into the structure, the approach, and everything that really resulted at the conference. And it was interesting to note, and I watched this along the way, you couldn't really pick out who was a process or a knowledge person unless you already knew that, because the types of questions, which sessions they went to, it was a group of collaborators, period, building, working, and learning together. So that was really powerful from the session. Holly, if you want to move forward here,
Sure.
Let's take a look now at one of the breakouts that really highlights this concept. Or actually, first, I'm going to talk about a few key principles. Sorry. You know, we've recognized for a long time, and our chairman of the board, former CEO Carla Odell, has said, knowledge is sticky, and without a process, it won't flow. And this is really true. The concept that we can put knowledge somewhere, but if we don't know how to access it, we don't know how to reuse it, then what's the point of that knowledge? The point of knowledge is to put knowledge into action, information in action, because that's where it drives business value and outcome. And again, without process, it's hard to achieve action, because the work that we do is through process, whether it's documented or ad hoc. So the knowledge to perform the work we do to achieve results, knowledge, process work together to get us to those performance and outcomes that we're after. So that was a kind of a foundational theme, and we illustrated that, and we challenged the participants to take advantage of that and take advantage of this collaborative opportunity. So moving forward into that first example of how this was demonstrated through our breakout sessions, this first one that we're going to share with you today is from Elevations Credit Union. And Sawyer Hamilton came in and really caught us up to date on where they were. Now, it turns out that Elevations Credit Union started a process journey over a decade ago because they had a strategic goal to achieve the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award. And in doing so, they recognized a limitation on how they were designing, documenting, and managing processes. And one of the early things they did was adopt the process classification framework to give them some continuity and connect all of the processes in the process work and give them a repeatable and easy to use structure. So we've collaborated over the years with Elevations Credit Union. And on that kind of process journey, they recognize that the process knowledge, the knowledge that truly represents what we do, how it's done, who does it, and how they collaborate together. What are the technologies and systems and tools that enable us to do it and make it better, faster, cheaper? Bringing all of that knowledge together and ensuring that those that need to perform the work have it at their fingertips so that they can achieve their ultimate goal, which is that consistently amazing user experience. So bringing process and knowledge together is just natural. And they recognize that in their BPM group, and they actually started their knowledge management initiatives within the BPM team. And over time, while there are separate knowledge-specific activities that need to go on, the process and knowledge side work hand in hand, focused on, again, driving to collectively capturing, sharing, and then delivering the user experience through that knowledge that enables people to do it. And one of the things they've done, which is a great illustrative content, and we talk about this on the knowledge management side, is one of the most successful things you can do with knowledge management is embed it in the flow of the work. Put it where people are already going. Don't make it extra work, make it the work that they do and how they do it. And Elevations actually achieved that because they really focused on embedding the knowledge in the procedures below the processes, the work instructions procedures, getting all of that critical knowledge that drives that experience at the fingertips. It's the way we train, it's the way we measure, it's the way we perform. So they were just a case study in this concept of knowledge and process, connecting, working together for the same common outcome. Don't do it separately, do it together. It's a force multiplier. So that's a really strong example. And there's more, and you can go and see, and at the end of this presentation, there'll be some links to where you can go and see the various presentations from the conference itself. With this, we want to get to a poll question for you, just to kind of get a sense for those of you on the phone today. We want to really get a sense for which of the following functions have you established partnerships with, right? Select all that apply here. And in the chat, there are details on how to do this. And we want to get a sense for, is it your strategy and transformation office? Are you linked and working with them? Because sometimes the process and knowledge, the focus on what's important and where it's got the greatest impact is to make sure it aligns to your strategy or transformations. IT, are you working with IT? Because guess what? They are creating not just the new and evolving technologies, but they're creating the entire environment within which so much of the work we do is dependent. So collaborating with them and working with them hand in hand is very powerful. Knowledge management, project management. If you have a PMO, are you working with them? Because projects are really stringing together processes to achieve some outcome, and therefore, making sure that process, knowledge, project, IT, maybe you've got an operational excellence team, an internal audit team. Those are some of the others you might want to consider and put them in here for the poll. Holly, I don't know if you want to build on that a little bit, or if we want to kind of look at the poll results at this point and see what we've got.
I figure we could look at the poll in a second. Actually, I wanted to add something to when you were talking about at the beginning and how you couldn't look and see a process person versus a knowledge person at the conference. My favorite aspect of that was having a lot of conversations around knowledge people who said they were process improvement people de facto because there wasn't a role for that in their organization, and vice versa. That business process management individuals were de facto content curators for their organization. All right, so we do have the poll results up now. All right. It looks like a lot of strong relationships there, and kind of work some of the things that we've seen recently, especially strategy and transformation, because process teams have had a lot of kind of movement into the supporting strategic objectives and being on those implementation teams, as well as making those strong relationships with project management and that kind of historical relationship we've had with IT, right, Jeff?
Absolutely, yes. And one of the things we see quite often with the organizations is that when there is some large strategy or digital transformation activity, you can't avoid but having project management, IT, and process all working together. We need to standardize, we need to stabilize, we may need to improve the processes, and therefore, you know, a PMO may be driving it from a project management perspective, getting from kind of a charter and a scope to the outcome, you know, getting it deployed to the business. But it's interesting that we don't see as much of the link into knowledge management in the audience here. And that's, again, an opportunity that we really highlighted at the conference. Let's find those synergies, and now let's take advantage of it. It's really interesting. I've met with some folks that were attendees at the conference since, and they said, we never had thought about it this way. We were going to focus on one, and now seeing the synergy, we really need to work them together. And they've changed their approach already to really give themselves the best of both worlds and not just work from one perspective, but balance. And then again, if there are people focused in different areas, they will work together with you. It gives you, as I said before, a force multiplier, more people working towards a common objective instead of you trying to do it for yourself, which is, again, sometimes overwhelming.
Right. And so one individual also said they have a strong connection with training and develop as well as quality management. And again, yeah, those are great long-term partners that we typically see. You know, process is the ability to help us with onboarding much quicker, creating capabilities much more effectively within the organization, and quality management and process have always been two groups focused on the same thing, right? Which is operational excellence.
Absolutely. And the other link there, I think that's important, and then we'll move on, is that if you think about change management, whether you're trying to improve knowledge behaviors and capture, transfer, and reuse of knowledge, or you're trying to simplify or automate current processes and get role clarity and good handoffs between people to make the process flow and achieve that fabulous customer experience, there's a huge change element to this. And so, training and development is part of change. Quality and it can be part of that change. And again, if you've got a change group and change methodologies, take advantage of that as part of your solution.
Right, excellent. All right, well, thank you guys. We are going to now move on to the next kind of big theme we saw. So we talked about partnerships, so that kind of strategic ability to gain multipliers of scale and great benefits. Right now, we're going to talk about like a little shift to more of the tactical aspect that we saw throughout the conference. And again, and that's looking at what tools PPM teams are employing through the presentations at the conference. So overall, there were kind of 4 key methods that came up discussed by process practitioners at the conference. While none of these are brand new, shiny tools, but they're still all core to how process teams are being effective within their organization these days. So I'm going to walk through each one of these. Had a great presentation example, and there's additional other presentations that link to each one of these, but I was just going to touch lightly on each one. So frameworks, APQC, we're a huge proponent of frameworks just in general. But frameworks are really great because they help us create a foundation to get some of the work done quicker by things like common languages, as well as having, an outline of all the potential processes an organization can do, which saves time and a lot of the process work. And one of the case study presentations on this was with Pratt & Whitney, and they really looked at how they used APQC's process classification framework for the development of a process library. Now, the whole reason they needed to do a process library was because they felt they needed to understand how work was getting accomplished so that they can then use that and feed into the strategy department to help, achieve their goals. So what they did was they took the PCF and they took like an 8-step kind of process approach that they did. And really what they were doing was working with SMEs in the business to kind of look through the framework and the process library and take it out of those vertical functionals and really then start looking at the processes in a horizontal approach. So really then taking it away from kind of that functional perspective and to gain benefits by looking at it end to end and laying out their library that way. They also worked with the SMEs to kind of then start attaching things to their framework to make it a little bit more useful in how they were wanting to support the strategy. So the first thing they did is they applied RACEs to all of the major processes. The whole goal behind that, and what was a bulk of a lot of work they did by connecting that to the framework, is to create accountability and create ownership within the business for the different processes that they were going to be tackling throughout the year. The other thing they did is they also used SIPOC so they could do that kind of horizontal look and piecing those pieces together. And then also they wanted to make sure, because the framework had things such as key benchmarks already, suggested for the different processes and things like that, to then really be able to use that framework for the benefits of performance management and benchmarking to help guide where they were going to be going. So again, they really kind of looked at how they used a framework to establish accountability within the business, and also really kind of tackle the idea of performance management for their organization. Now, process maturity assessments are also a really big thing, just as far as a foundational piece, because really it's understanding how do we improve processes and make sure that we have the most mature, best fit process that we can to support our efforts. And the example here was with one of the presenters, Grace Duffy. She and another colleague of hers had gone through and kind of looked what they called the BEST model, which is really then how do they go about assessing processes using about like 17 criteria to really make sure that they are designed effectively and that they're able to be improved effectively. And they really kind of had 4 different things around the accomplishment of this assessment that they do, which is to make sure they're focused on results. So looking at the measures aspects very, very clearly, applications of improvement methodologies, so that they can find those improvement opportunities in the assessment. And then really looking at making sure, how do we monitor these well-managed processes and making sure that we have all of these steps in there to be able to do that and be able to keep an eye on our processes and make sure they're as mature as possible. The third kind of big tool that a lot of people talked about is automation. I mean, we know automation has been here for years at this point in time, but a lot of organizations still kind of struggle with this idea of automation in a lot of ways. Though it's considered, the best thing to help really simplify workflows, come to scale and things along those lines, but organizations still kind of struggle with the amount of time it's going to take, the labor it's going to take to put in it, who owns it, and also making sure that the processes themselves are not just simply automated as is. So Rose Margot did a great presentation looking specifically at RPA and really kind of focused in on what are the kind of the common practices for automation. So what are some best practices about doing effective automation? She kind of walked through their journey of how they've tackled this idea of automation, and then really kind of how do organizations set themselves up for success. A lot of her focus then was really looking at the governance aspect as far as setting up for success and letting people understand that IT doesn't own automation. In the long run, the business has to be responsible for it. They have to be responsible for managing the bots. They have to be responsible for the outcomes, which really means then engaging them into the automation development. And the last thing she kind of really touched on was what she called the rule of 5. And that's really the idea that looking forward and determining what is a good fit bot really means that it can only have 5 decisions in it. It can really only touch on 5 applications and really have no more than 500 clicks for the bot to master to make it an effective bot for the work that they were doing. And then the last one is agile sprints. So as process teams over the last, I want to say 4 or 5 years, we've all really kind of learned the fact that we have to do things faster. The business is moving fast, and unfortunately process work also has to move just as speedily. And the great example from the conference there was AstraZeneca. Now, they had grown through mergers and acquisitions, so they had a lot of disparate processes going on in their organization. Multiple different standard operating manuals for different clinical trials that were all doing the exact same thing. At the same time, they were facing a lot of regulatory changes that were going to be impacting how they did the business work. So management decided they needed to take a step back and create some harmonization and some standardization within their processes that really focused on the new regulations. Now, the kicker for them is that they only had 1 year to overhaul their clinical processes. So they kind of then had to figure out how to fast track and kind of eat this whole beast of different processes in an effective, speedy manner. So they kind of had a handful of things that they wanted to focus on. Number one, they wanted to make sure the process work was focused and kept an eye on the new regulations coming down the pipeline, that it was really driven and owned by the business and the people who were going to be executing those processes. They also wanted to make sure to simplify it and make sure there was only one accountable and one responsible role for each one of their processes. And then they also wanted to make sure that it wasn't going to change the organizational structure. And the final thing is that they knew they had to be pragmatic about it and they had to be fast. So what they wanted to do then is they had to start figuring out, well, can we do a bunch of concurrent project work at the same time, or do we need to do each one piece by the other? And so they developed kind of 6-week sprints for each one of the process areas they were going to tackle. That way they could do multiple concurrent projects at the same time so they could hit their deadline. And for that part, like I said, they created a 6-week sprint. Week 1, they worked with their SMEs to outline the big steps. Week 2, they applied the SIPOC so they could then start driving in lower and start connecting the pieces together. At that point, they then use that information to create their first standard operating procedure. That then the next week went over to another set of SMEs to check and poke holes at it and see what was missing. And then they would take all that information in week 5, reiterate on the SOP, and then finalize it in week 6. So they were able to actually accomplish their goal in that year time frame, which was pretty spectacular when we're thinking about the scale of things that they were doing as a research organization.
Just to build on it real quick, Holly, and we can move on. But the point of these 4 methods and technologies are, again, they cross the boundaries of KM and process. And the presentations actually did the same thing. There were those that were focused on process frameworks. There was a KM innovation framework presented by Microsoft, and they spoke about that as part of their conversation. On the automation side, I think NASA came in and talked about how to leverage knowledge graphs within the KM tool set and really make those kind of actualized to drive actual behaviors of people. So again, there was process knowledge and the benefits of both, as we illustrated before, of your process knowledge is really supported by both. Just makes these very, very powerful concepts. And again, go out there and take a look. There's plenty of great presentations to catch up on if you weren't able to be at the conference with us.
All right, so that was kind of our dive into kind of the tactical aspects. We want to spend some time on the next theme, was this idea of solving business problems, right? So sometimes teams will get put in there to just standardize everything because we want to have our work standardized. And we've also seen organizations kind of spin their wheels where, they'll start a department with kind of vague purpose and statement, or a very specific piece that they're supposed to accomplish. And then the process team crumbles and they revitalize the project, the BPM team, every few years. One of the things we've seen is really once BPM teams are tackling solid business problems and focus a lot of their goals and efforts on those, they tend to wind up providing additional value, which helps make their programs in themselves sustainable. So a couple of examples of some of the organizations that talked about and shared their approach to solving a business problem with process management. The first one is Endress-Hauser. Endress-Hauser was one of those groups that they had started BPM program. It had great traction for a year or so, and then it kind of faded into the background. And then they did it again, and it would kind of fade into the background. And what they wanted to do was try something different. So what they really wanted to do was hang their BPM program around a huge organizational driver, and that was the customer experience. So what they did then was really take a long, hard look about how they were going to tackle user experience and design from a process perspective. And you can see here on the screen what they did was they combined the gray part here is the customer journey map. So all of the different phases that the organization or customers would go through as far as their interactions. But what they wanted to do then was actually tie it directly to the processes. So the blues and the greens here on the map are the actual kind of processes within the organization and how they map up to those different aspects of the customer journey. Now, the smart thing about this approach and what they did is they were able to then combine 2, which are typically disparate data sources. They were able to map out and understand their customer experience data, their customer data throughout all of this, and then look and see what the internal data performance for the different processes are. So that gave them a look at where they were having issues and how they kind of organized around the processes. So they can then pinpoint and also prioritize which things to work on based on that data, whether it's a larger problem in internal performance or if it's directly impacting that customer experience like they wanted to. So they were able to then take all of this information, put these two data sources together, and list out some problem areas. So they went through and prioritized a few of them. And what they did then was actually apply design thinking. They used the double diamond approach then to start taking those prioritized issues and really then start developing solutions for them. So the double diamond really has kind of two major aspects of it. And the first part is really about kind of scoping the problem. And that is where we understand who is being affected by the problem. Observing what is the actual changes, and this goes to the idea of design thinking, right? Not just what the data is telling us, but observation to understand what is the actual issues going on and what do people need from it, not just what they say they want from it. And then interpret those observations to specify a challenge. So here's the problem we're going to try to solve. And then the second part of the diamond is using kind of your traditional design thinking aspects of ideate, come up with a lot of different ideas of how we could approach it. Prototype, take the most promising ones and build short cycled ideas on solution sets, then test it and figure out which one is the best long-term solution for the organization. So again, here's just a really good example of how one of the organizations was able to tie their BPM work to a very specific organizational problem.
It's interesting, you know, I mentioned and talked about Elevations Credit Union earlier and that concept of bringing process and knowledge together. But they were in the same track as Andres Hauser and really trying to go after business solutions. You saw their goal, their common goal was that customer experience, that, you know, and achieving that consistency and kind of delighting the customer there. So in both organizations here, that's a huge part of it. Focus on the customer. That's ultimately why we exist. And it's a great rallying point for anyone to use that to bring these groups together. And then you can start focusing on some other internal and more micro challenges later.
Right. Yep. And it's an excellent opportunity, like you said, for BPM teams to really provide that value and that focus for the organization. The second kind of thing that we talked about and we saw an example of was actually based on a research and some presentation we did. So as we've heard over the last couple of years, organizations have been struggling with this idea of productivity and how do we make productivity better in our organization. So, you know, with Andres, we talked about a very external business problem, and with productivity, we're talking about a very internal business problem. So in partnerships, our knowledge and our process management research teams, we tend to do a project together every year. And last year we did one looking at productivity. So there's a lot of different ways that we've seen that bad process and bad knowledge can negatively impact the organization. Based on the data and the research we did, we found out that 2.1 hours are spent on creating workarounds for processes. So broken systems, broken processes, when organizations just kind of ignore them and continue with the workarounds, employees wind up spending a lot of wasted time, a lot more time than it would take just to actually do an improvement to solve the problem in the first place. The second kind of big one we see is this idea of recreating processes. Employees are also spending about 1.9 hours to recreate processes that either aren't standardized or documented, or even worst cases are standardized and documented and nobody knows where they exist. So instead, a lot of organizations have employees who just can redo their work. So there's inconsistency, there's a lot of time wasted on remembering or thinking through and creating new steps. And the last one is this idea of performing busy work. And as those of us who the process background, the lean background, means that they're not focusing on the value of the efforts and the work that they're doing. So they're doing a lot of kind of check the box things that don't actually drive the needle forward in the organization in general. And what we found from that is that process drains alone are 6 hours a week. So that translates to 6 hours a week, 3 days a month, and almost 39 days a year wasted just from these three things. It's about 15% of employees' time kind of no longer wasted because they don't kind of practice good process management in general. Now, knowledge management has very similar kind of points that they were having struggles with. You know, their people are wasting almost 3 hours looking for information that already exists somewhere. So that means the information is either not in the workflow of work or it's not documented anyway. They're also spending another 1.7 hours looking for people to answer their questions, people who have expertise in a particular project that they may be working on, who the right SMEs are to talk to. And then as you can see, once people can't find what they're looking for, what are they going to do? They're going to recreate it. So again, then you have people spending 2 hours a week recreating information that already exists, or 1.7 hours recreating and reconveying information that exists or has been communicated in other places, because the knowledge and the content management isn't set up to be in the flow or accessible to everybody who needs it. So though process is partially a big problem, knowledge drains are an even larger problem in organizations. And that's 8.2 hours per week, about 20% of the time every week spent either looking for information, recreating information, or reconveying information over and over and over again. And that in and of itself has resulted in, let's see, what was it? 8 hours a week, which is about 4 days a month, and then 50 days a year spent wasting either finding or creating information. Right. Jeff, do you have anything to add on this one?
No, I think the numbers speak for themselves, and everybody can relate to this. It's again, a common problem. And this is, again, part of the promise. So if we want to truly impact our organizations on productivity, worker effectiveness, you've got to focus on simplifying the capture and access and reuse of knowledge, and ensuring that it's in streamlined processes that focus on what's important. You know, and not having to make it up or figure out the process as you go, which sometimes occurs. So powerful message here, great opportunity for us all to contribute back to the organization with some very impactful kind of outcome measures.
Right. I think one of the best things I heard after this presentation was, thank you, you just gave me data for my business case. So that was also a nice to hear. So these are just kind of an external and an internal kind of focus for the organization and how process teams can address them and help the organization move forward. The next part of this, and really the last theme that we're going to talk about, is this idea of focusing on people. We all know that we talked about strategic partnerships, but one of the groups that we left off on that list was employees in the business, as they are our best partner as far as any of the work that we're doing. And I don't think a lot of the reasons we don't add that on there is because we all know that. And we all know that building a long-term relationship with people in the business is really the most valuable thing for us as far as moving forward. So, and as Jeff mentioned, we had some great keynote speakers. They all really focused on this idea of people and engaging people and setting people up for success and better ways for us to integrate and work with people. So the first kind of keynote was Dan Kramer, and he really was talking about design thinking. And that goes here over to these first two kind of circles here on the left. And this idea of design thinking, which really helps us get out from that internal perspective and looking at ourselves and our processes and focusing on problems or a solution, and really focus on the people that are impacted by these problems that occur in the organization. So again, this idea of customer centricity, design thinking is great because it really helps us understand that idea, not just of what customers want. We all can know that, you know, teams will come to us with a broken system or thing like that, and they have an idea of what the solution is already, but it may actually not be what they need. So really being able to dig in there and think from the end user's perspective about what their experience is, so you can know what is the known things that they can talk about and tell you what's going on, as well as the unknowns and the things that they may take for granted or not really consider a problem that may be at the root cause of the issue itself. And then that second part of design thinking, which is applying that iterative design methodology, right? Again, this is really looking about what is the best solution, not necessarily what's the first solution that gets brought up as a suggestion. And the idea of being able to take multiple potential solutions, prototype them, and do the fail fast method to find what is going to drive the needle the best in the organization. One of the reasons I love design thinking is because it kind of combines two things, right? Ethnography, which is really understanding people, their drivers and what's important to them, and that human centricity, as well as agile, which gives us the ability to move fast and be iterative in a way that allows us to reduce the amount of resources it's going to take to get to a solution, as well as finding the best solution.
Now, I build on that real quick, Holly, and say that if you think about it, what often happens is we look at our organizations, the problems and the solutions kind of as they're two-dimensional, and they're not. They're multidimensional. And the focus on customer, focus on people, systems, technology, knowledge, and this iterative kind of concept of design methodology includes looking at the problem and the solutions from different dimensions and getting to the best solution that balances across them and creating something that is going to be a system of system solution, not flat and a point solution, so to speak. So it's a tremendously powerful way of thinking that enables us to do things together and do them better.
Great add in there. Thank you, Jeff. When I say with one of the other keynotes talked about this idea of stories, right? Stories is not really anything new for us, but we do know that narratives really help us engage with people. It helps us understand information better. That's why we like storytelling, because it helps us internalize things, and also can help drive collaboration for people through shared experiences. One of the keynotes, Lance Weller, really talked about two major ideas, and that's the idea of narrative. So a shared experience, but also that there is kind of a couple of key components around the design of the experience that help us really then be able to connect with people and drive purpose if we include those in how we develop the narrative. The first one is this idea of thematic frame, right? So this is the parameters or the information that's already known about the experience, the problem, the challenge, the new project. And that's kind of the ground setting for what is going on in this. The second part of that is then what he called the trace. And what the trace really does is talks about and shows how there can be different contributions to the experience. So what are the different levers or the different interactions that can happen that can change the experience within the organization? Now, the third one is this idea then of granting agency. And so we've identified what these potential levers are. We know what the framework of the experience is, but how do people have the ability or the agency, empowerment to manage those levers and be a part of changing the narrative and the solution? And then the last part then is really this idea of serendipity. So we have multiple people who can identify themselves as part of this shared experience. They know that they can potentially change parts of the experience, but the serendipity is then how do they work together and collaborate in a way that effectively makes the narrative a thing. Now, the idea, like I said, of storytelling is nothing new to any of us. We all include things like success stories. And when we talk about engage the business and in the project work that we've done, the whole idea behind success stories is creating a shared experience that has all of these components in it to get other people to engage and apply and use all of the different things that we're offering them. And then the last one is this idea of bridging the gap with emotional intelligence. So we had the final keynoter for us was a guy named Bill Benjamin. And he understood and talked about a little bit of the fact that, we understand that anytime we make changes, anytime we have a project, we have to engage people and work in change management and address things like their fears and their hopes and their dreams and all the rest of this in the work that we're doing. But as he talked about, emotional intelligence is really vital, not just because we need to understand how other people work, but also how we experience and what the emotions are around changes in general. Now, the idea is that, we've probably already heard this before, when people experience change, they wind up having that fight or flight syndrome because our brains are kind of follow similar patterns every day. We have these deeply entrenched patterns in our brains. And when something comes along that knocks us out of that pattern, we go into the fight or flight symptom because our brain doesn't know what it's doing. There's something there. It's potentially a threat. And so we start getting our brain flooded with cortisol. And that has a lot of different kind of symptoms. The reason it's flight or flight is because it is a mechanism we have for, the whole story of the tiger in the woods. We hear a sound, we think it's a tiger. It may or may not be, but because it disrupts our normal patterns of how we think, we go into that automatic fight or flight syndrome because we can't sit there and cognitively think through all of the potential impacts of these things. So when things hit us on that emotional level, it hits us hard. We get flooded with cortisol, which turns off that cognitive part of our brains. The other thing that I found interesting from what we were talking about is that same hormone hormone that floods through our brains to have us have that emotional reaction to something outside of our comfort zone is actually also the same hormone that emphasizes negative emotions. So I know a lot of people tend to be very negative when we're talking about change, but it's also a part of kind of how our brains are set up to do that, because it wants us to react immediately to anything that it considers a threat, and makes us think about it in a negative way so that we can avoid or fight or get out of the way of it. The whole idea behind this, looking at the brain science, was super interesting, but also the real idea behind it is you have to understand not just how other people react to these things, but how you react, because there's a couple of different things that happen there. People tend to pick up subconsciously on other people's emotions. So you have to understand not only what are your triggers, how do you react when you are faced with something new or a new change or something that you feel threatening, because then your emotions are going to bleed out into your teams or the people you interact with. So you have to pay attention to what your triggers are and understand that. So you can then do the same thing for all the people who are experiencing the same thing on the other side of that bridge, the people that you're working with in the business, the people on your team, and how their interaction with change. So again, anytime we talk about brain science, or we had somebody on that, they're always great, and a lot of fun to kind of geek out on.
Yeah, one more quick point on that. I think it just helps to illustrate, and it came up in the keynote, was the concept of biases, right? The whole fight or flight is based on your experience, something new or something, unknown. And the biases, just like the response triggers for you and then those you're talking to, you have to recognize it. The biases are kind of another way of thinking about it. And it was illustrated by saying, let's say that a leader or manager you respect, you've always had a great experience with, comes and says, hey, I've got this fabulous new initiative and I'd love for you to be part of it. And you're like, oh, this is really exciting. They came to me, right? Your bias is to say, I believe in this person, I trust them, I respect them, and you're positive. Now, the same exact initiative coming from a leader that you think is like difficult to work with, they're always creating busy work, and you're like, oh, not another one of these. Oh, what's he going to waste my time on now? And so the bias is your natural reaction before you even have cognitive thought. And one of the things you want to do with these biases, both for you and those on the other side, is to slow down, take a moment and say, wait a minute, am I reacting to the bias, to the fight or flight? If I can just slow myself down, now I can be a little bit more rational and make it effective and collaborative and positive, as opposed to just going to that natural reaction. So there are techniques that are out there. So whether you think about it from a fight or flight and a reaction to a bias, and how to now avoid the biases, very powerful in every interaction we have.
Excellent. Thank you. That was an amazing ad, Jeff. All right. So in addition to our keynotes, we also had several of the presentations also talk about and focus on the people part, right? And one of the examples, the one example we're going to talk about here is CMI. So CMI came and did a presentation that focused on how they really focused on people, employing them in their shared service group to identify, solve problems, and really create a culture of continuous improvement. And they did this by kind of really marrying two things. First off, they focused on shared values, and that was the cultural values of the organization. So as they're working through and developing this idea of continuous improvement, they linked that back to their cultural values: teamwork, learning, how they add value to the organization overall. And those were key words that they used as part of this. They also then tied it to what they called 4 pillars of success. And the first one is organization. So how did they structurally create continuous improvement in the organization in a way that it would succeed and encapsulate and empower people? So what they did was they used a core team of continuous improvement experts, but they also had a decentralized network of about 20 different process champions throughout the organization, and shared service centers through different kind of countries within the organization, and focused on making sure they had a good representation also of HR, finance, IT, all the rest of the people that were in that shared service center. And the second one was making sure that they created standardized language and behaviors. Now, part of the language was focusing on words that reflected the corporate values. And the other part was adopting methodologies that they then would use consistently. In this case, they actually used APQ 7 tenets is how they phrased and the paradigm in which they looked at and communicated about process work and process improvement. Third was technology. They also made sure that they had a single technology that they were using for the BPMN work. So one place throughout the organization to focus on developing their maps, putting together their repositories, and all of the rest of those things along that. And then again, they really set methods for the organization, a standardized set of methodologies and approaches to the engagement. So they really kind of broke up 4 key milestones as far as how they engage each one of the groups. And the first part was inform. So phase 1 was to inform and let people know what was going on, what was going to change, and what they could expect. The second part was teach. Make sure that everybody who was going to be working on improvement work was trained and had access to the standardized tool the organization put together. And the third part was then plan. Again, they had a very set of milestones for the different process and improvement projects that everybody would be conducting. And because they had that standardization, it really helped them with their fourth part then, which was accomplish. So, going through and celebrating the wins and the projects as they hit key milestones or went into completion to really engage everybody within the business and making it a shared success for all of the improvements that occurred. So again, this is just one of the examples. I know a lot of the different people talked about a lot of the tactics and stuff that they use to engage people in their work.
Yeah, I often say when I'm talking to member companies, we can focus on improved technology. Even we can go out and put together world-class, best in class kind of processes. But if we don't focus on the people, it typically will break down. So collaboration, engagement, making it simple for people to know who and when and how to work together. It just is amazingly powerful when we get there. And that's all then driven by culture overall. And to get to and change your culture, it takes a transformation, which is time and effort. You can't just buy a culture.
Definitely, very true. A lot of work with one-on-one engagements and the value and all of this blood, sweat, and tears associated with that.
Absolutely.
So we had one more poll question for you guys. We wanted to know, so which theme do you feel will affect your PPM efforts the most this year? So is it really, the idea of building partnerships and sharing strategies and looking for groups that you have complementary capabilities together? Pinpointing those business problems, so really looking at those business problems that you can support and drive that value add and sustainable value out of your program. Focusing and really getting to make sure you have the tactical toolbox together that you need to accomplish your work. So those methods and technologies are really then engaging, empowering people and our partners there. As far as kind of the ones that you feel are going to affect your work and kind of drive the needle for you this year.
It's interesting with these, it depends on where you are and where you're going somewhat. You may have gotten certain progress and maturity around methodology and technology, So if I was answering this for APQC, from my perspective, I would say engaging and empowering and pinpointing the business problems, right? Those are where we're at. We've spent 3 years getting much stronger on our process content management. And now we're able to be a little bit more surgical to focus on the harder things to solve. And so that's part of the journey there. You can't just jump right into the hardest problem, even though it's good to focus on something that has a little bit of depth to it to really illustrate the power of what we're after.
So, all right, Nikki, do we got responses? All right, so, okay, it looks like the majority kind of really look at that, which is focusing on that business problem, so that long-term sustainable value, showing that, and also then the methodology and the people part in particular are strong things that they're going to focus on. I'd love to know if building partnerships and shared strategies is because you guys already have well-developed strategies and partnerships, or is it just something that you're not at that point yet to work on? So if any of you have thoughts on that, if you want to include that in the chat, that would be great.
It's interesting. We had a study we did way back on the 7 tenets of process management of things, and we asked the audience, where did you start with process and process management? And they focused on modeling and mapping and improvement and technology. And then we said, if you could start over, where would you start? And it was strategic alignment, it was governance, it was making sure they had an infrastructure and an environment that supported the good process work. But then the caveat they all said was, but if we don't make a difference to the business and outcome, what's the point? So while it's great to build stronger partnerships and methodologies, et cetera, you still have to ultimately achieve the outcome of the business there. And again, that's where I think your priorities are. And it's well-founded, I think.
Well, Julie just kind of echoed that, which is they need to get their house in order before they can then start really focusing.
Yeah, so a little bit of infrastructure, and then make a difference, and then come back and make the infrastructure better, stronger, continually over time. Continuous improvement of this kind of integrated approach between knowledge and process excellence.
Right. It looks like others have talked about the fact that they've already spent a lot of time on relationship and stakeholder engagement and empowering people, but they can only get so far in those relationships if it's one-sided, or it's just kind of them pushing that as well.
Yeah, great insights.
All right, excellent. Thank you, guys. All right, Luca said they're value mapping. So starting with kind of understanding that discovery work is usually a great place where a lot of people start, just in general. So we're now going to be at the Q&A portion of this. I know we have one question that has been submitted already, so please feel free to add your questions into the Q&A tool. And Jeff and I will either answer them live. If we don't know the immediate answer, we will make sure we follow up with you and get answers to your questions. So one of the individuals asked, is the sequence meant to recommend an order to be followed? And I believe that was submitted when we were at the methodology section. There was no order of intent as far as, frameworks, maturity, automation, and agile. That was just happenstance order that they got put into. But a lot of organizations, when we're talking methodologies, they really focus, said discovery is a lot of place where people start. And that's usually using a framework to understand where they're at in their process world.
Yeah, and I would add to that oftentimes people jump into one, whether there's a strong sponsor or some other driver that takes you to focusing on assessments or sprints or automation or frameworks. But ultimately, the strongest thing we can do is, even if we're driven to focus on one, always look across these and say, when and how can I bring these concepts together, and make sure that I don't just focus on automation for automation, but I think about it of how it links and enables frameworks, maturity, and the ability to work and drive business results in an iterative fashion with Agile. So they really do play together. Don't just think you work each one individually.
All right. Okay, any other questions, folks? All right, we got one that just came in. We're starting out establishing process, and the APQC framework is an incredible source of guide to us. The generic framework question, the APQC generic framework places manage projects under develop and manage business capabilities. What if one of your product services is managing projects for their clients? Would you move it under the deliver services operating processes group, or keep it in support? So that's a
answer.
Oh, you want to answer it?
I want to answer that one. That's a great one.
Answer that one.
I will give you what we would guide our members to do. And the first thing is, you move it where it makes the most sense for your organization. If you need to move something around, do it. But recognize I said for the organization, not just for one group. So absolutely, your service delivery projects to your clients are under category 6, for instance, right? 5 and 6, if you really think about it, with the service delivery and the customer support. Whereas the business capability is used across the entire organization, both internally and externally. So at APQC, we have our internal projects, we have our client-facing projects. We kept it under business capabilities, category 13, recognizing that when we're doing our service delivery, we're not going to repeat those processes. We actually used the category 13 processes within our service delivery end-to-end flows. So that's how we avoid replication. But we also want to use it for our internal IT projects, our internal marketing projects, et cetera. So we kept it under the business capabilities as a more generic, comprehensive place that any part of the business can use those processes.
I would say that's a great answer. Because one of the things people need to remember about the framework is that it's mutually exhaustive, or mutually exclusive, categorically exhaustive. Now, it's not set up to show this is a process flow or a model or a map. It's a list of all the potential processes that we've put in hierarchy groups. Now, it is, you guys are.
And I'll add one more quick.
Oh, okay.
I was going to say, I'll add one more quick point to that, and I'll illustrate the power then of the framework. Within APQC, I'm actually the project management process owner. So I'm responsible to ensure the integrity of those processes. Whether it's for an advisory project, which is my department, or whether it's a research project or another project. Well, it turns out that there are variants of that process at the procedure level in particular, and then the RACI charts of roles and responsibilities. And so we recognize that while there's a standard set of project management processes at the higher level, that each department may have their variant. And my job as process owner is to ensure what's common and standard is coordinated, and that when they do something different, it makes good business sense. So that's another reason why you leave it in the business capabilities and not let it become the control of one part of the business universally. I didn't say that correctly, to the exclusion of others.
Right. Right. And yeah, the whole point is you can take that piece and use it in your different maps and models. And that's why it has two numbers. The hierarchy ID is at like 4.1.2. I always akin that to the driver's license. So yes, that number is going to change wherever you put that process element. But each one also has a 5-digit unique ID. And I always say that's the social security number. So no matter where you move it in your framework, that number stays the same regardless. So I know we are at time. Thank you guys. This has been great. The recording, yes, will be made available and sent to you within the next few business days. So you guys have been great. I loved your questions and thank you again.
It was a great time, and I hope to talk with each of you if you have questions as ahead. Just reach out to myself or Holly or anyone at APQC.
Right. So next steps, we will be sending you guys the slide and the links to both the overviews from the conference as well as the presentations can be found here. The overviews are available for a short time to non-members as well. And if you have anything you'd like to share with us, please feel free to contact us. Or if you're interested in our upcoming research agenda, you can click here to see what projects we have coming down the line. Also, connect with us at all the places where you connect with other organizations. We're on LinkedIn, Twitter, as well as our blogs, Facebook, and we have YouTube content as well. So thank you all, and I hope you have a lovely rest of your day.
Bye all.